Hello, Tifo Football Podcast listeners. I am Josh Schneider-Weiler, host of Tifo's This Football Life podcast, and today I'll be hosting this bonus episode. Don't worry, Joe and Alex will be back with you on Monday. Today we are joined by journalist Tom Williams, whose work you can regularly read in Bleacher Report and AFP. He is the author of the new book, Do You Speak Football? A Glossary of Football Words and Phrases from Around the World, which you can buy in bookstores and on Amazon starting today. In this episode, we chat about the new book and focus on how the language of football has evolved in countries around the world. You'll hear Tom explain why Germans love to use the word gherkin, who is football's William Shakespeare, and which country has a similar football lexicon to England. And most importantly, you'll learn lots of new terms like cholismo and zweikampf that you can impress your friends with. If you want to continue the conversation on this subject, go on Twitter and use the hashtag #DoYouSpeakFootball. So without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with writer Tom Williams. I'm here with Tom Williams, author of the book, Do You Speak Football? Tom, how are you doing today?
Very good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. We're in a beautiful place, Finsbury Park. It's about to be springtime. No complaints here.
What could be better?
Exactly. So you just wrote this book, and you were telling me it's an 18-month process. It's out into the world. Let's start with a super easy question. What's something you learned writing the book?
Something I learned so much. I mean, this was the great joy of writing a book, was that I was writing about all sorts of football cultures that I knew very little about, and even the football cultures that I thought I knew something about, Italy or Brazil, Argentina. You're still discovering things, and I think from a personal perspective, one of the joys of the book was the relationships that I formed with the various contributors who were helping me out, and basically the way I sort of got into the book, the way I went about researching it, was by establishing a network of contributors in all the different countries that I wanted to write about, and
which is like over 150 or something. I mean, it
feels
like
I think there's about 90 countries in the book.
It feels like almost all of them. When you read it.
I mean, the initial idea for the book was that it was going to be a chapter on each of the major football nations, and then a sort of best of the rest, where we just throw.
Honestly, that's what I thought when I picked it up.
Yeah. And then as I got into the research process, and I was finding so much interesting football vocabulary from beyond the traditional major nations, I thought, actually, well, we could probably open this up and try and do a global football glossary, which is what it's ended up being. I mean, I might have overstretched a little bit to try and get there, but I think hopefully what the book will show is something from every nation with any kind of football history, and for me personally, as someone who, both as someone who writes about football for a living, but also as someone who just loves football as a fan, it's been fascinating finding out about all these different phrases from different countries. Yeah, I mean, it goes from Romania to Costa Rica. I'm assuming you don't speak all of the languages. So, what languages do you speak? Yeah, well, so this was one of the big challenges. So I speak English, I speak French, I speak a little bit of Portuguese, and I studied Welsh at high school until the age of 16. I wouldn't make any claims for the quality of my Welsh. So I was writing about a lot of languages that I didn't speak, and whereas some of the Latin languages I'm able to kind of follow, thanks to the French and the little bit of Portuguese that I speak, there's an awful lot of languages that I can't follow. So I've been very dependent on the assistance that I've had from people who do speak those languages, sort of guiding me through them and showing me the interesting vocab. Yeah, so you were like, okay, I'm going to go to Panama, and I need my Panamanian expert, and you just Google top football writers Panama, and then basically boom. Yeah, I mean sometimes I would I'd find an article written by someone on a particular country or a particular team, and I think, okay, well this person obviously knows their stuff, can I get in touch with them? And yeah, sometimes it was a case of just sort of going on Twitter and finding who is tweeting about Panamanian football, who is tweeting about Turkish football, whatever, getting in touch with them and explaining the concept of the book, and hoping that they kind of got it, that they were in some way enthused by it, and also that they were in a position to help, because sometimes, people, everyone who I got in touch with was helpful, trying to be helpful in some way, but sometimes there were people who weren't really able to, kind of explain the sort of things that I was looking for. So it'd be a case of kind of trial and error, and then, see if I can find someone else from that country as well.
Yeah.
So yes, it was quite a long process.
Well, I mean, football, there's so many diehard football fans for each country that you can always find just teams and teams of people. But which country, now looking back on it, sticks out as some of the interesting ones that you called someone or you emailed someone and you're like, wow, I knew it would be interesting, but man, I had no idea it was going to be this.
I mean, that happened a lot. That happened an awful lot. And what would happen during the process often was that I would email someone introducing myself, explaining the concept of the book, and asking whether they had any ideas or any pointers. And then I'd get an email reply, and sometimes that email reply would just open this whole world of vocabulary from a country, and that was really exciting. And that happened quite a lot. I remember there's a guy, Kostas Bratsos, who covers Greek football, and he helped me with some of the vocab on football in Greece, and he came up with so many suggestions, and they were fantastic. And I had a really difficult time whittling down all the stuff that he came up with, because it was so strong, and because it all matched the brief so well. And I tried to limit myself to a set number of terms for each country, but there were quite a few instances where I really found it quite difficult to respect those limits that I'd set myself, just because there was so much good material.
Yeah, well, I mean, since you mention it, are there any that stick to, come to mind that you couldn't think, that didn't make it into the book that you maybe in retrospect wish had, or that, if there was ever a part 2 that would be in there?
I mean, to be honest, there's nothing that I had to leave out of the book because of space restrictions that I really kind of agonized over. At some point you just get to a point where it's like, okay, well, this is what it's going to have to be, and there has to be a line, and the line is there. This is what we use.
We have to move on.
This is what we leave aside. But what's been funny has been, since I announced that the book was coming out on social media, I've had people get in touch to say, oh, have you got this phrase from wherever, or this phrase? And there've been a couple of times where someone suggested some great phrase, and I hadn't come across it, and it's not in the book. And what's one, for example? There was an Italian one, and I mean, if any country in the book was deserving of a book dedicated purely to its own football language, it would be Italy. But I just think the depth, the richness of Italy's football vocabulary is basically unparalleled. And someone flagged something up. This is after I'd announced that the book was coming out on Twitter, and it was an Italian term for a means of controlling the ball in a way that brings it under your control but keeps a certain degree of pace in the ball. So it sort of sets you up for whatever's coming next.
That's so specific, but
so specific. And
beautiful,
Italian football is just full of things like that. There's an equivalent term in French, which is un contrôle orienté, like an orientated control, which is basically you bring the ball under control, and in the same movement, you're setting it up. You're getting it out of your feet for the pass, the shot, the cross that follows, the sort of thing that Zinedine Zidane was an absolute master at. But I'd not come across this in Italian, and when I started off researching a book, I used to think about how I'd feel getting to this point and having people come to me and say, oh, by the way, you didn't have this phrase from Timbuktu or wherever, and how that would make me feel. But I quickly realised when I was researching the book that was inevitable.
Yeah.
And
you're never going to get every single one.
Yeah. And I don't want this book to be seen as a definitive collection of football language. It is the football vocabulary that I happened to find during the research, which was as exhaustive as it could have been. But even with that, there are inevitable boundaries to how much you can include and how much stuff you can find. And I mean, I'm sure I'm going to come across all sorts of material that could go into a second book. So maybe there'll be scope for that.
Yeah, well, you got to keep it open for the second one, right? What you mentioned how Italian has so many different words, and obviously English has an incredible amount. All the people listening to this or watching this will all hopefully, or I imagine, speak English. How would you compare the English lexicon to some of those? I mean, because we always think, the stereotype at least, is that French, Italian, all these languages are a little bit more poetic. At least that's the general American stereotype. Is they're a little bit more poetic? Is that true? And did you find that the case?
I used to think the same thing, and then when you actually look at the vocabulary of British football specifically, there's a huge amount of poetry there. There are so many metaphors and idioms, and because we've all grown up using them and hearing them, you forget how colourful they are. Even things like, a manager whose squad has been ravaged by injury, and you'll say that his squad is down to the bare bones. What a kind of, almost kind of Dickensian image.
It's a beautiful metaphor right there,
and there's stuff like that throughout the language of British football. I think one area where Britain falls behind some of the Latin countries is when it comes to technical football language. And again, this is something that I mention in the book, and I think part of it comes from the fact that as the inventors of the sport, or as the inventors of the modern sport, there wasn't the same desire to go around naming things. And Britain presented football to the world, if you like, and along with that came all the linguistic foundations. Offside, goal kick, goal, and these are words that have been taken throughout the world, and that form the basis for so many football.
They got the name of the sport right too, football.
Yeah, exactly.
I know, because it's not always called that in every other country. Like I think foot target is one of them.
Yes.
So it's like Croatia, could you imagine if that was what we were all calling football, is foot target? It just doesn't.
Doesn't work as well. But I think that one thing you don't find in British English is the technical detail you get in some of the Latin languages. And there's an example that always comes to my mind when I think about this. It's the piece of skill that involves a player knocking the ball past his opponent on one side and then running around him to collect it on the other side. One of the simplest and most enduring skill moves that there is. You see it in almost every football match you see, and it's never been named.
And it's such a pain in the ass to say too.
Yeah.
Like
and the quickest way to describe it is by saying, "Oh, he knocked it past him on one side and he collected it on the other." Yeah. Whereas in France, that is a grand pont, a big bridge, and it's sort of the sister term of petit pont, little bridge, which is a nutmeg. In Spanish, it's an auto pass, like a self pass. In Brazilian Portuguese, and I think actually in Portuguese from Portugal, it's a drible de vaca, a cow dribble.
Wow, yeah.
So all these other countries saw that there was this skill move and thought, well, that needs a name because it keeps happening all the time, and we'll need to know how to refer to it. Whereas in English, we never got there, and I did find that quite a lot. Also, when you look at the way that positions are broken down, and again, obvious point of comparison with Italy, which is really the home of the very specific tactical delineation in terms of the different kinds of role within, say, defenders, midfielders, forwards. So many different names for all the different types of midfielder or defender you might find, whereas in the UK, we've never really gone in for that, and it's only really been the last 10 years or so. And I think with the advent of the internet and then social media, that's fueled it. That people have started to look to foreign football cultures and to appropriate some of that terminology, recognizing that it just doesn't exist in English.
Yeah, no, I actually wanted to get into that, and how some of these, how some of this language came about, like where it originated, because there's a lot of different places where it comes from. I mean, in each country, sometimes it'll come from a player, Sometimes it'll come from a famous broadcaster. So who are some like famous, I don't want to say pioneers, but like who's like the William Shakespeare of some of these countries that are setting the language, direction?
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the really enjoyable elements of researching the book, were the moments when you could pinpoint with 100% accuracy where a particular term came from. And that happened quite a lot in Italy, thanks in large part to Gianni Brera, the great man of letters of Italian football. He was editor-in-chief of La Gazzetta dello Sport, amongst other things.
And can
he
you
was a novelist,
give like a time period? What are we talking about?
So this was, he became the editor-in-chief of La Gazzetta in 1949. His career sort of spanned 50s, 60s, 70s as well, I think. And he was responsible for basically creating Italy's modern football lexicon. And there were two strands to it, if you like. One strand was his desire to map out the divisions of labour on the football pitch as precisely as possible. So it wasn't just, fullbacks, centre-backs, midfielders, forwards. It was different names for those things. Things like, he was the man that coined the term libero for the sweeper. And it's thanks to him, in large part, that Italian football has such a variety of different terms for different positions. And then on the other hand, he was great at coming up with nicknames. He gave nicknames to all sorts of different people. One that I mentioned in the book is the name that he gave to Gianni Rivera, the great AC Milan playmaker, who he wasn't very impressed by, and who he dubbed L'abatino, the little monk. Yeah. Which basically meant, okay, obviously this guy's quite talented, but he sort of wanders around looking nice, doesn't really get stuck in.
It's a brilliant nickname.
Yeah, and it stuck, and it dogged Rivera for a lot of his career, and that then became a name that would be attributed to a player with similar characteristics, and everyone recognises the talented number 10 who has an eye for a killer through ball, but who doesn't really ever put a tackle in or break sweat. Yeah. And there's another great Brera nickname, Euclideo, after Euclid, the great Greek mathematician, and that was for someone who moved around the pitch in a very precise way, calculating and problem solving. And I think Fabio Capello, when he was a player, was one of the people who was given that nickname by Brera, and his influence continues to be felt. So I think if you're looking for someone who has really shaped a country's football vocabulary, it would be Brera in Italy.
I feel like we don't get as good nicknames. Maybe this is just like recency bias, but I feel like we don't get as good nicknames now as we used to back in the day. Like, if you just look at like kind of the top 5 footballers right now, like Ronaldo, Neymar, Messi, and like Suarez, like. Do any of them have really good nicknames?
I guess,
not really.
Messi is like the little flea, but then he doesn't. But you don't hear that all that much.
If it was that good, that's what we would all just call him.
That's what we'd call him. Yeah, and I guess Ronaldo is CR7, but then no one, with any self-respect, can utter that.
No, I think he coined that himself. Anyway.
Well, exactly. Yeah. There's certainly. I don't think there's as much poetry in modern footballer nicknames. Yeah. But you get the odd exception.
Yeah, for sure. I want to get into some of specific countries and quotes from the book, which I found tremendously interesting. I'm going to read a quote about Germany, which was one of the most interesting countries, in my opinion, in the book. The quote is, "The renaissance that followed, culminating in the victory at the 2014 World Cup, was language-led. A massive drive to improve coaching standards created a new, sophisticated linguistic landscape that would liberate German football from the tactical straitjacket that had previously constrained it." That's a little bit of a mouthful, but the first sentence was the most striking. You saying it was language-led. So can you be a little bit more, specific or elaborate on what you mean by that?
Germany is a really interesting example, and although I'm here to plug my book, the definitive book on this topic is Raphael Honigstein's Das Reboot, which is all about how German football, realising the extent to which it had fallen off the pace, pulled itself up by its bootstraps and reconquered the world. And it's around the last turn of the century, Germany had this catastrophic group stage exit at Euro 2000. And although Germany had always been successful internationally, it was quite stagnant tactically. The country was wedded to back three defensive system, to man marking, and all the other tactical developments that were going on elsewhere weren't really being taken up in Germany. And there was a real drive from within the German Football Federation to do something about this, and the emphasis was placed very firmly on the education of Germany's coaches. And there was a real drive to try and raise the level of sophistication in the way that tactical concepts were taught and discussed. And then the next phase of that was finding coaches like Jurgen Klopp, for example, who had the necessary intelligence and confidence to take those concepts from the pages of the coaching manuals, apply them on the training pitch and then in matches, and then talk about them and
so verbalize and pass that along to other coaches, because it was so in the grassroots it was so important.
Yeah,
is that what you mean?
And it's like that's how phrases like gegenpressing have entered the global football lexicon, and it's interesting when you look at Germany's football lexicon as a whole, because it strikes me in many ways as being quite similar to Britain's football lexicon, in that there's a lot of humour, there's an awful lot of colour, and a lot of mischief even, and there's a lot of emphasis on the physicality in the sport, on the importance of duels. There's this great German term, zweikampf, meaning duel, and it's been measured in German football for years, and it's seen as this key metric, the zweikampf, and it's basically, a zweikampf is like a one-on-one duel between two direct opponents, and statistics for zweikampf are collected every season, and then at the end of each season you can see which players won the most duels, etc. And so in Germany's modern football lexicon, you have terms like zweikampf, which are almost sort of relics from the time before.
You tell that story in the book. I'm blanking on who the player was that was like, I think after a loss, and they were just like, we need more.
Vicente Lizarazu, when he was playing for Bayern Munich. I forget which season it was now. It was the early 2000s.
Like in 2001, 2002.
Something like that. Yeah. And Bayern had made a really impressive start to the season. Everyone was really excited about the sort of football they were playing, and there was talk about them sort of entering into like a new age almost in terms of the style of their football. And then they went out in the Champions League group stage, which obviously for a club of Bayern standing is a disaster. And there was this great quote from Vicente Lizarazu, who spent several years at Bayern Munich, was never really comfortable speaking German to the media, and so would often give interviews in English. And he came out with this quote, something along the lines of, you have to forget about stylish football, you have to win zweikampf. Yeah. And that's like the literal quote. And that kind of sums up that German attitude to the importance of getting the better of your direct opponent on the pitch. Yeah. And I think you get that a lot in Britain's football language. Well, the idea that it's all about,
language
the 50-50s.
can shape an attitude or it can reflect it, and which is I think what you're getting at. But I do want to. We can't talk about Germany and not get into at least one or two of the comical bits about German language. They have a couple instances they refer to gherkins or pickles for us Americans. In their language, gherkin passes, and what is their fascination with gherkins and pickles.
So yeah, you're right. Cucumbers or gherkins or whatever, they crop up quite a lot. You've got gherkin pass, which is a bad pass. Gherkin troop, like a cucumber troop, is like a bad team, like a poorly performing team. I think gegurke is another one, which means like cucumbering around, and that's if someone's sort of messing around. And I'm not entirely sure where that comes from. The only thing I found was that the word itself, gurke, meaning cucumber, it comes from the stem of the word is from a Middle Greek word, agovros, which means unripe or immature. So there's something in the stem of that word that suggests immaturity, not quite being at the required level, shall we say?
Interesting.
But I've beyond that, I've not come across any better explanations.
Of all of the things in the book, that was just the funniest thing to me, and like I kind of want to like start using those terms in English, like that was a cucumber pass, or like that was a pickle pass. That was especially pickle pass, the alliteration.
It's quite pleasing.
Yeah, it's described. I thought that was pretty interesting. And then there one more quote. If there was a World Cup for talking a good game, the Dutch would win at a canter. Can you explain why?
I think this is the legacy of Johan Cruyff, above all. When Holland became a football power in the 1970s, everything was led by Ajax and then the Dutch national team. And as a result, everything was led by Cruyff. And Cruyff, more than any great footballer in the history of the game, was associated with his ability to talk about football, to articulate a vision for what football should look like. And that has provided the basis for the way that Holland as a country has thought about football ever since. And I just think you find with Dutch coaches, with Dutch players, there is this idea that football should be played in a certain way. And Holland isn't alone in having a football culture that is like that insists on, good football. But I feel like there's more room for pragmatism in some of the other football cultures that are comparable, whereas I think the Dutch, and I'm aware that this is quite a big generalisation, but this notion that there is a Dutch way of playing, that's been there for a long time, and it's the 4-3-3 formation, it's the insistence on controlling possession, manipulating space, having the wingers wide, a certain degree of tactical universality where players can sort of move around, and that comes across, I think, in Holland's football vocabulary, that idea that there is a Dutch way, and that is the only way. And there's a quote from Cruyff about the importance of winning with style, and how basically, if you're not going to win with style, there's almost no point, which flies in the face of so many other football cultures, but sums up brilliantly and very succinctly how the Dutch approach football.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because the last time they were in the final of a World Cup, 2010, they played most undecidedly not Dutch, anti-football, some would say. And
even Johan Cruyff said that he was supporting Spain, basically, because that was the great irony of that final, was that you had Holland against Spain, and yet Spain, the Spanish team, with all their Barcelona players and their tiki-taka football, they represented the legacy of Cruyff and the Dutch way of playing, whereas the Dutch team represented something quite different. And I've written this in the book, but I think of all the major defeats that the Dutch have succumbed to in international football, I think that was the one that was the least painful, because in a way it was almost a rejection of that style of football, that very un-Dutch, very attritional, like aggressive kind of football. Whereas, when they lost in the finals in 74, 78, that was
they
the
lost
true
their
Dutch
way.
football.
Yeah.
And they went out honourably, playing the way that they wanted to play, the way that they felt that they should play.
Yeah, well, I found it interesting, while we're on anti-football, because one of the first terms in the book is anti-football, or it might be like the first one, with Argentina. And, they talk about anti-football, and then, in each word you have is, if there's something similar, they, you reference like, oh, this is a similar word in Czechoslovakia, or in the Czech Republic, or in whatever. And for that one, anti-football, you had a couple interesting terms. Let me just get them out here. Anyway, you had park the bus in English, of course, and then you had cholismo in Spain, and then catenaccio in Italian. And what struck me about that is that here you have the same terms, but with decidedly different connotations in each language. Park the bus in English is not a term of endearment, but to many in those other countries, cholismo, in Spain was, which I found very interesting. Why do you think that is, and did you notice that as well?
Yeah, I mean, those terms have been grouped together quite loosely. The idea is that if there is a term in the book that has related terms elsewhere, those have been flagged up, so you can kind of see how they overlap.
Which is really interesting. I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah, and it's the thinking is that it's a different way of navigating through the book. You can, that the book is laid out continent by continent, country by country, but at the same time there are thematic strands that run through the book that you can follow. And I think in that instance, there are clear differences between something like cholismo, which is almost like a way of life, and it is a very specific term to describe Diego Simeone's coaching style, and particularly the way that it has been put across at Atletico Madrid, and has enabled them to punch above their weight in such a remarkable way for such a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's been like six years now.
Yeah, and they're still going.
Yeah.
And then you get terms like catenaccio, and catenaccio is a fascinating term because originally it described a tactical concept, the move of moving a defender back behind the line of defence in the sweeper position, the libero role. Yeah. And in time, catenaccio came to stand for the kind of cynicism that the teams that specialised in that system, particularly the great Inter Milan and AC Milan teams of the 1960s, that they became sort of prone to. And then park the bus, as you say, which tends to be used quite negatively. I think a key difference here is time. I think when you look at the Estudiantes team of the mid-1960s, who were the first real exponents of anti-football, you look back at the distance that we now are from that period in 2018, 50 years ago. Yeah. And I mean, some of the stuff that they did was absolutely appalling. There were stories about players carrying pins onto the pitch to stab their opponents. They would research the personal lives of the players they were coming up against, so that during the game they could just drop all these little
which you really had to do in the 60s. It wasn't like Google.
Exactly.
You could just
you really had to put the hours
check
in.
out their Wikipedia.
And they were also an extremely dirty team.
I mean, they ended up getting arrested at when they played AC.
Well, I mean, two notorious Intercontinental Cup matches in the late 60s against Manchester United and AC Milan, absolutely brutal contests. And at the time, the contemporary reports were expressed the complete shock at these sorts of tactics and how completely unacceptable it was. But 50 years later, you look back, and you can look back almost with a degree of fondness, because so much time has elapsed, and it's almost like crimes. The way that crimes can be glamorized.
Well, you still hear, you hear people, old timers right now, like being like, "Oh yeah, I remember back in the day when you used to be able to elbow some guy in the face."
Yeah, exactly. And it's part of it is nostalgia. And I think you put enough distance between things that were once found unpalatable and they can be repackaged. The same way that, you know, a brutal murder might one day be glamorized, might be turned into a book and a film and all sorts, whereas at the time it would have been completely shocking.
Yeah.
In the same way, like brutal football, whereas at the time will have seemed appalling, with enough space in between, people start to think of it almost as like a kind of like, you know, I think because there was almost a cartoonish element to the violence of those Estudiantes teams, that now stands out. And I'm sure that when we come to look at, you know, Jose Mourinho's park the bus tactics, which were nowhere near as cynical or as violent as that Estudiantes team, it will be seen with a lot more affection than currently, purely because of that factor, because of how time changes perceptions of things.
Yeah. I want to jump into one thing before we get to a couple, like, you know, favorite words and terms and that. Something that's, you know, really interesting is obviously you had, you know, all of these European countries colonize, you know, Africa, North America, South America. You have English, and, you know, in England is different than obviously American and Australian English, and you know, you have France and French different in Africa and Spain, South America likewise. So I'm curious, how did you see it different between those languages in their, for lack of a better word, host country versus the colonized country, for lack of a better word, and then compare, like, maybe was English in the United States and England vastly different compared to, you know, Spain and Mexico, or like with the Spain and Mexican, is it that different versus the UK and the American, or if you know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I mean, like, no, you get differences. I mean, I find the language of American soccer like fascinating, and I'm sure you'll have views on this as well. I mean, this book was written for a British audience, so I've written about the language of American soccer from that perspective, and the knee-jerk reaction of the average British football fan to a bit of American soccer commentary will be to recoil.
Yeah, like, I think that the term you have is dislocating. I have some, yeah.
And it's because there is such a thing as an American soccer lexicon.
No.
And it's different to Britain's football lexicon because it's followed its own evolutionary path, the same way that every country's football lexicon has. And I think an issue here is that if you were to listen to what any other football language sounds like in English, you'd think it sounded really weird. Take a random example from France. If a guy volleys the ball with his heel, it's known in French as an aile de pigeon, a pigeon's wing. Yeah. Now, if you were to take that and just present it to a British football fan, like, oh, you see that great pigeon's wing? Oh, that was fantastic. Yeah. They'd be like, well, what the heck's that? Like, that's not how we talk about football. And yet there's nothing in America's football lexicon that is any more outlandish or any more weird than anything you find in France or Spain,
but is it as
India
drastic,
or wherever?
Is the difference as drastic between Spain and Mexico, or Spain and Peru or Argentina as it is between England and the US?
I mean, it's hard for me to comment on that as a non-Spanish speaker, but one thing I would say is that something that the United States has had to contend with that I don't think you get in Hispanic American countries, South America and Central America, is this, and again, I'm talking about this from a British perspective, but there is this sense in Britain of America being sort of latecomers to football, you know, sort of appropriating a sport that isn't theirs and doing it in a very clumsy way. Whereas I think if you're a Spanish person looking at Argentina or Uruguay, say, there will be a respect for their football cultures because because there's a greater acceptance of the right of countries like Argentina and Uruguay to a football culture of their own. You know, they were the first two great international football teams, for example. You know, and
I think it's just because we call it soccer. I think that's where it all stems
from. That's like
from.
a massive thing. But I mean, like, soccer's a crazy one as well, because it's only been the last few decades that soccer has become this unusable word in the UK. And like, you look at football magazines and football books.
Yeah, that was the one thing in this book
I
don't think that I really noticed is that there wasn't really an in-depth look at the
I mean, like,
term soccer.
In the section on the United States, I found myself using the word soccer because if you write American football, that's a separate sport.
Yeah, of course.
You know, you can say Italian football, French football, Spanish football, the meaning is clear. If you say American football, it's confusing. Yeah. And so I personally don't have a major gripe with the word soccer because soccer was used interchangeably with the word football in the UK for a long, long time. And in recent years, it's come to be seen as the exclusive preserve of the United States. And almost like as a symbol of the United States' failure to properly understand the sport. But like, I mean, my dad still says soccer. He's 68.
Yeah.
You know, he's lived in the UK his whole life, and he will use soccer. And you know, that's just a word that he's grown up using. And I'm always a little bit wary of people who absolutely hate soccer as a word, because it has a long history in this country. I mean, I was saying before, in like sort of the 50s and 60s, when you had the great footballers of the time, if they were bringing out a book or there'd be a magazine article, it would be, you know, Bobby Charlton's soccer skills or you know, or whatever. And there was none of this awkwardness about it. And soccer is a British term, you know, anyway. It's not like it came from the States. I mean, soccer was a shortened form of football, association football.
Yeah,
so
I had this argument with someone one time because I was like, people forget also that American football is over 100, it's like 120 years old. It was like invented in the 1890s or something, so it's really old too. So. But I don't want to make this all about the lexicon of American soccer or football. But I want to get to some of the funny, interesting, my favorite terms. Do you have a couple? I want to start with you.
Okay, I've had a think. Some term. I mean, my sort of favourites change quite a lot, but I've sort of thought of like a little top three. There's a Cantonese term, carp wa, which literally translates as arranging flowers, and it's used to describe a step over.
Freaking beautiful.
And I really like that, because I think it just captures the sort of essential decorativeness of the step over. And there's something a bit disdainful. If you describe a step over as arranging flowers, what you're saying is stop fanning around and like get the crossing kind of thing. There's a term from the Netherlands that that continues to tickle me. If the ball is bouncing around inside the penalty area and the defending team are tripping over their own feet trying to clear it and there's total panic, you might hear a Dutch commentator say, "Vrouwen en kinderen eerst," which means women and children first. Obviously, that's an expression that we have in English, but in Dutch football, it's used ironically in those terms, you know, to sort of describe
really captures the mood.
Total chaos. Yeah. I really like that one. And then probably my favourite term in the whole book is a Finnish term, and to describe it, when a bear hibernates.
Yeah, I had this one too, yeah.
When a bear hibernates, a mass of matter forms in its colon, and it's a mixture of feces and intestinal cells and hair. And while the bear is asleep in its den, this lump of
poop,
basically poop,
just
grows in its bum. And then when it emerges from its den in the spring, it shakes this thing out, it lands on the floor. And if you are strolling through the woods in Finland, this is the sort of thing that you might encounter. There's lots of bears in Finland. Anyway, the Finnish name for this is pikatapi, which means
happy you said it,
fecal
not me.
plug.
Yeah.
And in Finnish football, a pikatapi is a holding midfielder. And that amused the hell out of me when I came across that.
Encapsulated, yeah, because it's the plug.
Yeah,
for
it's
the
people
people
it's the guy
not.
who plugs the hole in front of the back four, and if you have the misfortune to play in that position in Finland, you're likened to a lump of poo that's fallen out of a bear's bum.
That was my favorite as well for like most bizarre, weirdest one. I'm gonna go through a couple of mine as well. And this part of them, most of them are funny or just because of interesting origins. The Anglican in Czech. By the way, I'm going to butcher all these because unlike you, I haven't.
I know.
heard them.
I'm sure I'm butchering them as well.
But the Anglican in the Czech Republic is used when the ball goes in off the post in honor of Jeff Hurst in the 1966 World Cup final. So it's pretty incredible that they have an entire term based on a moment in British football history. So there's that.
And there's a similar term in German as well, Wembley Tor, Wembley goal, and that describes the exact same. I mean, you can understand why the Germans
like
might cling
goal.
to it.
Yeah.
So a Wembley Tor is basically a phantom goal,
Yeah.
because of Jeff Hurst's famous third goal. But yeah, less surprising that Germany should have clung to that than the Czechs.
Of course, yeah. That's so random. And then Bundesliga, it's means mullet in Denmark, and it's what they use. They call a mullet based on the German Bundesliga, which is just incredible. A hairstyle based on the German.
It's like Bundesliga hair is essentially what it means.
Yeah.
And I think it's just a reflection of the fact that in the 1980s, every single German footballer had a horrendous mullet, often paired with a dye job.
Just brilliant.
And lives on in Denmark.
Oh, just incredible. This one just close to home. Gordie Howe hat trick, which I wish a British commentator used. When you score a goal, get an assist, and have a fight in the same game. Because in hockey they do that quite a bit.
I mean that's in the Canada section in the book, and I've not actually found an example of an actual footballer who has managed to pull off a Gordie Howe hat trick. But then
I'm sure it's happened.
Danny Dichio came quite close. On his Toronto FC debut, in that he got a goal. He got sent off for some act of violence. Yeah. Didn't get an assist though, I don't think.
Well, I wouldn't
imagine
in football, people don't actually fight like they do in in hockey. I wouldn't expect that, but even the little foot shoving, would make a Gordie Howe hat trick. And then the last one, just because I'm a little kid at heart, the arts card, red card in Germany, take it from your ass.
It comes out the back pocket. Yeah.
It's simple, but just a little funny. Immature. You in the book you tell a number of beautiful old stories, that many of which I didn't know before. Is there anyone that you learned or heard about in some country's history that you were blown away by or that you were fascinated by?
I mean, I think as I said earlier. One of the things I really enjoyed researching the book was when you were able to pinpoint the exact moment when a term entered a country's football language. And there was a term that we use in English, fox in the box, for a sort of predatory striker. And that interested me because it sounded very similar to a French expression, renard des surfaces, which basically means fox of the boxes. It's essentially the same thing. And I wanted to see whether there was any kind of link between the two of them. And it turns out that Fox in the Box entered Britain's football lexicon in the summer of 2001. Arsenal lost the FA Cup final against Liverpool at the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff. They took the lead. Arsenal dominated the game, couldn't kill Liverpool off. Liverpool scored twice at the end through Michael Owen, went home with the cup. Thierry Henry was being interviewed in the mix zone by some French journalists, and he was complaining that Arsenal didn't have a player like Owen, someone who he referred to as a renard des surfaces, a fox of the boxes, and called on Arsene Wenger to buy a player like that, to play alongside him, so that they'd have that element in their team. The British press latched on to this remark, Renard des Surfaces became Fox in the Box. Later that summer, Arsenal signed Francis Jeffers from Everton, and when he was presented to the media, Arsene Wenger said, let's hope that he will prove to be the Fox in the Box that everyone's been talking about. And with that, Fox in the Box became part of the lexicon and has been used ever since, and is now used very commonly and understood very, very widely. But prior to that afternoon at the Millennium Stadium, it wasn't a term that had been used, and that was a great discovery.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, it might even outlive Thierry Henry's name. They might be using it in 100 years, and people will have forgotten about him, and he'll be in the next book 100 years from now. It's amazing, but it's a great story of how a word or a phrase comes into footballing language. It's a beautiful example. For people going to Russia like myself, for the World Cup, what's a term that we might be hearing in Russian football? Or
okay, there's one term which comes from Russian folklore, balabol, meaning chatterbox, and a balabol in Russian folklore was someone who's talked too much. So you might hear a Russian football fan complain about a garrulous TV commentator they don't like, or a coach who's always shooting his mouth off. That's the word they might use. Another one of my favourite Russian terms is derevo, which means tree, and a derevo is a technically inadequate, usually quite immobile footballer who sort of stands around almost as if he's taken root. And the Berezutski twins, who are still going, CSKA Moscow, somewhat incredibly, were both saddled with this nickname or this name early in their careers. So if there's a guy on your team who just sort of stands around doing nothing,
there always is,
can't control the ball, then that's what you'd call him in Russia.
Oh, brilliant. Parting shots. Do you have any last words for the audience? Anything you'd like to promote? Obviously people can go buy the book. Do You Speak Football? We only scratched the surface of all of the fantastic terms and stories in this interview. But is there anything else you'd like to mention?
If you're interested in football and if you're interested in language, and particularly if you're interested in both, I'd recommend buying the book. Hopefully.
Or just good stories. Like, honestly, that was my favorite bit about, because I didn't even see that coming.
There's lots of little anecdotes and little historical stories. One thing I would add is that there is a hashtag, which is hashtag Do You Speak Football? And I'm going to use that hashtag to share photos and video content related to the book. Because one of the things, I read a lot of football books, and something I really enjoy doing when you're reading a football book is when someone's describing a goal you've not seen or an incident in a match, is seeing if I can find it on YouTube and having a watch of it. So I'm going to prepare a bunch of content so that if you come across something in the book and it piques your interest, if you have a look at the hashtag, then hopefully you'll find footage of it or a photo of it or something.
Fantastic. Well, you keep it going, kind of like...
Yeah, and sort of get a conversation going, as they say on social media.
Exactly. Get the people to, follow up with that. Okay, that's fantastic. Well, I'll use those, and thank you so much for joining us on this show.
Thanks for having me.